Hello, and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I'm your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, and I promise we will get to them as soon as our very special guest presentation is over. With that being said, I never get tired of saying this. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our guest this evening, one and only Robert Spencer. He's the director of Jihad Watch, Shellman Fellow at David Horowitz Freedom Center, expert on all things Islam, Jihad, and Sharia, and he's the author of over 20 books. My very favorite, The Truth About Muhammad. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Annie. Always good to be here, and thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
I got to say, at the beginning here, that it seems like I have a feeling of deja vu. I don't know if anybody who is watching this now has the same feeling, but don't you feel like we've done this so many times before? I don't mean the webinar. I mean the Hamas attacks Israel. Israel responds. The United States stops Israel from responding and enforces or forces a ceasefire. Everything is quiet for a while until the next time, and it happens again. And so I find it strange that this keeps on going, keeps on happening, and nobody ever seems to learn a lesson from the fact that it keeps happening and nothing changes. The title, of course, of this webinar is Who Won? And that in itself, really, it's not really a fair question. I apologize for the question already, because modern wars aren't fought to victory and defeat. When was the last time somebody won a war? Maybe World War II? I suppose the Vietnamese won the Vietnam War ultimately, but after we left and stated that it was all taken care of, after World War II, really, the United States has not fought wars to win and has kept Israel from doing so ever since really the founding of the modern state of Israel, with a couple of notable exceptions, of course, 1967 and 1948. 1973, the Israelis were advancing into Syria and were defeating Syria and Egypt, and the Nixon administration made them stop. That's happened many times since then, and of course, most notably in this recent instance, where first we saw Netanyahu say there's not going to be any ceasefire, and then practically the next day, there's a ceasefire. Now, this was an interesting situation because on the Israeli side, they said, well, this is because of the fact that we did so well. This is because we actually, I've even heard people say, somebody asked me this morning, didn't they just run out of targets? I find it hard to believe that they did. I bet there's plenty to hit in Gaza that is still known to be a Hamas installation. But in any case, the Israelis did set back Hamas to a tremendous degree. Some people are saying that it's going to be 10 years at least before Hamas reaches the same level of weaponry and development that it had before this last conflict. And so that's a major victory for Israel. At the same time, Hamas is claiming victory. The sponsor of Hamas, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is claiming victory. And of course, we can dismiss that as being empty braggadocio, the same sort of thing that happens whenever a non-Muslim debates an Islamic spokesman. No matter how clearly and decisively the non-Muslim may convince the audience and show that, well, of course, it's very easy to show that Islam is not a religion of peace and all that. The Islamic side will always claim victory. And it's the same thing in these conflicts with Israel. But in this case, actually, both sides have a case. Israel, because they did damage Hamas to a tremendous degree, but also Hamas. In the first place, Hamas emerges as a very clear victory in the conflict within the Palestinian Arab territories to begin with. or those that are claimed to be Palestinian Arab territories. The Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas stood by and watched all this happen and didn't help because he didn't want to strengthen Hamas as his own rival against his own hegemony and the hegemony of his friends. Leadership in the Palestinian territories is an extremely lucrative proposition. They are the world's biggest welfare cases. They're billions of dollars, trillions of dollars showered upon them by the United Nations, the European Union, and now once again by you and me, the American taxpayers. And a lot of that money flows into the coffers of the leadership. Mahmoud Abbas has become a multimillionaire. Some of the Hamas leaders, Haniya and Mashal, have become, I believe they're billionaires. And they don't have a trade. They don't have a business. They didn't gain this money in any lawful fashion. They gained it like Hunter Biden got rich and Joe. It's all about whose advantage you're working for, what kind of money they have, what money they're putting in your pocket to do their bidding, and so on. So obviously Mahmoud Abbas and his sons, having enriched themselves to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars at the expense of the aid money that was supposed to go to the supposedly starving Palestinians, obviously they don't want the gravy train to end. They don't want Hamas to emerge even more decisively than it already has as the popular leader, the popular group that the Palestinian people actually want leading them. So Hamas won in that sense over the Palestinian Authority because they were able to position themselves as being the courageous fighters against the Israel Defense Forces, the wicked Israeli war machine, and so on. And the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas just stood by. Hamas also won because they got the ceasefire. In the day before the ceasefire was announced, we heard that Hamas officials were begging for a ceasefire. And some high-profile Hamas supporters were out there calling for a ceasefire, notably the execrable rock star Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, who made a video calling for a ceasefire, and other people who have been high-profile supporters of the Palestinian Jihad. Why were they calling for a ceasefire? This is the part that nobody in the United States government ever seems to understand or care to understand. And yet this is decisive. Hamas calls for a ceasefire when it's losing. Hamas does not call for a ceasefire because it's winning and is magnanimous. Hamas does not call for a ceasefire because they really love peace and want quiet and normal life. Neither of those things are ever true of Hamas. Hamas wants a ceasefire according to Islamic law, which is the law of Hamas, because when they are losing, that is one of the only two reasons given for a Muslim army, which is what Hamas is, to call for a ceasefire with, or to conclude a truce with, a non-Muslim army. The other condition that might allow for a ceasefire is if the Muslim army has reason to believe that the non-Muslim army is going to convert to Islam. Obviously, that is not the case in the case of Israel, nor is it ever the case, pretty much, unless the non-Muslim army is already losing and is prepared to submit. But when the Muslims are losing, and this is a stipulation in all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, when the Muslims are losing, then they can justifiably ask the non-Muslims for a ceasefire, a truce, a temporary cessation of the fighting. There is no permanent peace agreement that is allowed because, as the Quran says in chapter 8, verse 39, fight them until religion is all for Allah. So if you have to fight them until religion is all for Allah, you don't ever stop. You don't conclude a peace agreement that rules out the possibility of future fighting. You might come to have a temporary truce. Islamic law stipulates that it's 10 years, but then you have to fight again. So Hamas is losing. They ask for a truce. The United States, wanting to end the conflict, presses Israel to take the truce. It is not clear that anybody in the American government has any idea of what the meaning of asking for the truce is. What they should have done at the time that the truce was requested was tell the Israelis, and what the Israelis should have known, maybe the Israelis may know, but they're not really in a position to go ahead without the approval of, at least the tacit approval of the American government at this point. You have a state that's already so terribly isolated on the world stage. The last thing they want to do is lose their largest, most formidable ally. So if the American government wants them to stop, really, they're going to stop at this point. But the American government should have told the Israelis, this means that Hamas is losing. This is the last time, the last moment at which you should conclude a truce. This is the moment in which you should fight on all the more strongly in order to defeat them decisively and maybe even definitively, so that they can't fight again, so that there's no more Hamas. And it's not inconceivable that that could happen. Aside from the imagination of the FBI of the modern age, there really aren't Nazis anymore. And maybe a couple here and there of idiots who like to posture. But the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as a formidable group on the global scene, is long gone and is not coming back. And Hamas could join it in the same dustbin of history, but it of course has to be forced to do so. It's not going to do so voluntarily. When it calls for a truce, that's when the Israelis actually have an opportunity to send it to historical memory and erase it from present day reality. And yet that's when the Americans call upon them to stop. This is part of the larger misunderstanding, misapprehension of the entire conflict. And you may have heard me say this before, and you may well hear me say it again. But the fact is that if you read the statements of Palestinian Arab leaders, and you read the statements of the Iranians, and the statements of the other governments worldwide that support the Palestinian Arabs, you will find that universally, without any exceptions, they speak about Islam. Now you could say, well, the European Union gives money to the Palestinians. They don't speak about Islam. Right, I'm talking about in the Islamic world. Every last one of them, they don't talk about land. They talk about occupation and so on, but these things are clearly just talking points for the benefit of the Western media. They always bring it back to Islam. For example, Mahmoud Zahar, who was the co-founder of Hamas, he was interviewed just the other day. He said, we are the owner of this area, Arabic area. This is well known as an Islamic area. Now, to say this is well known as an Islamic area, that doesn't even make any sense to the United States State Department. If you say, what does it mean? If you went up to Anthony Blinken right now, the Secretary of State, or anybody in the State Department of Joe Biden's handlers, and asked them, what does it mean that Zahar said this is well known as an Islamic area? What are the implications of it being an Islamic area? Why does the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran always speak of it in terms of Islam? What does Islam have to do with this conflict? They would look at you like your dog does when you say, you know, Rover, you really have to stop getting into the garbage and spreading it all around the kitchen. He doesn't really understand what you're saying at all. It's just sound to his ears. And he understands maybe that you're not happy, but that's about it. I don't mean to insult your dog. I know you love your dog. He's a wonderful animal, but we have to be realistic about his capacity to understand human speech. And it's the same thing with the State Department. We have to be realistic about what they understand and what they do not. It's very clear that ever since the founding of the modern state of Israel, the State Department has shown that it has no idea of the implications or importance of the Islamic aspect of this conflict. If it did, in the first place, it would never have asked for a truce, as I have explained. It would also understand that any kind of negotiated agreement is foredoomed to failure. Now, you might think that they would already have learned this lesson, except the State Department is actually not even as bright as your beloved dog. The State Department doesn't learn lessons. So you have the fact that in 1948, the Palestinian Arabs were offered a state, and they turned it down. They were offered a state later, they turned it down many times. Ehud Barak, when he was Prime Minister of Israel, offered them 95% of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, turned it down. Now they say, oh, we have to have a state. This will solve everything. And the Americans believe it. The State Department believes it. The fact is that the whole conflict is predicated upon Islamic principles that led Mahmoud Zahar to say, this is an Islamic area. And those Islamic principles preclude the success of any negotiated agreement. You'd think after Camp David, after Oslo, after the roadmap, after all the other attempts at a negotiated agreement, that somebody at State Department would realize maybe negotiated agreements are never going to work. And maybe trying to bring the Palestinians back to the negotiating table is silly. And maybe showering millions of dollars upon them, hundreds of millions, again, after Trump had stopped the money, maybe it's not wise. But they don't think this way. The fact is that the Quran says, very simply, drive them out from where they drove you out. That's chapter 2, verse 191. Now that's a phrase, I can say that to you and say that's the key to the whole conflict. And you'll say, yes, that's nice. Drive them out from where they drove you out. What's for dinner? And people don't understand the implications of that statement. Drive them out from where they drove you out is a command from Allah. You see, Allah is the author of all the Quran. So if Allah says, drive them out from where they drove you out, you have to do it. It's as if he said, it's all those things that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, people take for granted as being divine commands. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, etc., etc. Those things are not negotiable. They are not subject to polling. They just are what they are. And it's the same thing with this. If the Quran says drive them out from where they drove you out, then you have a divine responsibility. You have a responsibility before Allah to do that. This is why it's so important that Mr. Zahar said, this is an Islamic area. Because what he's saying is, we were driven out. We don't have it now. It's an Islamic area. It was ours, but it is no longer. And therefore, we have a responsibility before Allah, before the supreme God of the whole universe, to drive out those who drove us out. Now, if you have read, and if you haven't, really, why are you here? If you have read this book, The Palestinian Delusion, I'm not serious. You're not required to read books that I write, but really, I write them for you. I do. So anyway, I won't be hurt though. If you read The Palestinian Delusion, you will find numerous examples of Palestinian Arab news sources reporting in the late 40s and the early 50s that the Arab League, the leadership of the Arab world, actually called upon the Palestinian Arabs to leave the area. They were not driven out. They were told to leave by the Muslim Arab leaders because they thought they would destroy Israel completely and then they could go back in a few weeks. It didn't work out that way. They lost the war. So they didn't go back, but they were not driven out. However, as you well know, it became a staple of Palestinian jihad propaganda, repeated as fact, taken as fact by the UN, taken as fact by the establishment media worldwide, but nevertheless still not fact, that they were driven out by the Israelis. and so they are refugees. And this unique refugee status that the Palestinians have is unlike any refugee status anywhere else in the world. It's passed on to the children, to the grandchildren, to the great-grandchildren, people who've never been remotely near the area and weren't born. Everywhere else, if you're a refugee, if you leave one area and go to another, and your children are not refugees, but the Palestinians, they are. And that makes for millions of refugees as a rhetorical stick to beat Israel with. But they were not driven out. Nonetheless, it is part of the Palestinian mythology that they were driven out. And that's very important because it establishes the basis of the whole conflict. There will be no peace between the Palestinian Arabs and Israel, because there will always be people who will believe that they have to fight to drive out the Israelis as a result of this Quranic imperative. Now, this doesn't mean that everything is hopeless. If the Israelis stand strong, and if they act strong, then they can exist indefinitely, because there will be jihadis trying to destroy them. But there's another thing that Islamic law says that the State Department should also know but doesn't. And that is that you do not wage jihad if the enemy has more than twice your strength and you have no chance of winning. Why was this attack by Hamas launched now? Why wasn't it launched, say, 6 months ago? What changed? Exactly. Thanks, Annie. Biden's handlers became president. And what happened? They immediately signaled to Iran that they wanted to make a deal with Iran, no matter what. And they would remove the sanctions that had been so effective in knocking back the Islamic Republic and weakening it among its own people, as well as weakening its ability to engage in terrorist adventurism worldwide. The Biden's handlers want to remove all the sanctions, reimpose the Iran nuclear deal, which is essentially a green light for Iran to get nuclear weapons, and they resume giving the money to the Palestinians without any conditions about the Palestinians stop the genocidal preaching of hatred and jihad against the Israelis and the total destruction of Israel. So that is for people who understand the world in terms of strength and weakness. And the Palestinian and the Iranian mullahs, they understand the world in terms of strength and weakness. They see weakness in that. Oh, they're giving us what we want. They are accommodating. They are accepting our hegemony, and they are giving us what we have demanded. And so they are weak. Now's the time to press forward because our enemies are weak. And they knew, of course, that they could attack Israel, and that Biden's handlers would side with them, would not side with Israel. Actually, they surprised the world a bit in standing with Israel more firmly than I think Hamas expected, but still not all that firmly, and still pressed Netanyahu about civilian casualties while ignoring the fact that Israel is the most punctilious army in the world in terms of avoiding civilian casualties, and engaging in other pressures that showed that they thought that the Israelis were the aggressors. So all this comes back to their misapprehension of the conflict. The Hamas side, the Muslim Arabs, they understand the conflict better than Biden's handlers, because they understand that this weak administration coming into power meant that this was their time to act. But Biden's handlers don't understand that, and they don't understand why the conflict exists at all, and they don't understand what to do about it. So, unfortunately, the very fact of the truce, because it was concluded at a time when Biden's handlers should have been telling Israel to press forward all the more strongly. Israel should have been explaining this to them and trying to convince them of it. Instead, the whole thing stops. That in itself is a massive victory for Hamas, because it ensures the fact that This is just yet another episode in this endless conflict. There's going to be another later, and many more after that. And that a decisive blow against Hamas still is in the future if it ever comes. So unfortunately, that's the situation. And thank you very much. If you have questions or comments or what have you, then, well, that's what we're here for.
I don't know why, but somehow I was so hoping you're going to conclude that Israel won. I know. I can hope.
I hope too, but I have to call it the way it is. And there's no doubt that they did damage Hamas. I would like to see more than just damage to Hamas, but the destruction of Hamas. And as I explained, I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. And there are many precedents of organizations that once bestrode the world or some region of the world like a colossus and struck fear in the hearts of everyone, and then they are no longer with us.
While we wait for questions to come in, let me ask you this. I understand you said that Israel couldn't just go forward and finish what they should finish with Hamas, and they had to listen to what America or the government or Biden handlers had to say. But what would happen if Israel did move forward, press forward, and Hamas was part of history? Now, what would be the consequences for Israel per se?
Well, for one thing, this this ongoing sore, this bleeding sore, this situation in Gaza would be resolved. And the message would be given to the supporters of Hamas among the Palestinian Arabs that the Israelis are not going to give at this point. They are not weak, and thus it is not time to wage jihad. And I think eventually you would find that that would lead to a pacification of the entire situation. An analogy is in India in the 19th century. In India in the 19th century, the Muslims kept waging jihad against the British occupiers. And the Hindus came to terms with the British occupiers. They didn't like the occupation any more than the Muslims did, but they behaved more realistically and less barbarically. And so they came to an accord with them and worked with them. Ultimately, of course, they worked for their independence and won it. But in the 19th century, you had the Hindus working with the British and the Muslims refusing to. So the British just essentially bypassed the Muslims and did business with the Hindus only. And the Muslim communities grew impoverished and isolated, and the Hindu communities prospered until finally there was a Muslim reformer named Syed Ahmed Khan who began to teach that really there was no need to wage jihad against the British because they were not impeding the practice of Islam. And so the Muslims could lay down their arms and come to an accommodation with them. And they did. I'm not saying that this was a total end to the conflict or that it obviously didn't hold indefinitely, but there ensued a period of relative calm. And so I think that the same kind of strength displayed by Israel and by the United States could lead to that. But nobody is even considering this as a possibility, or considering that the Palestinians, seeing that there is no chance of victory in jihad, might heed the Islamic law that has guided them all this time already and actually stop fighting. But that's what Islamic law would prescribe. And Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have made it very clear that they are following Islamic law.
Okay, questions are piling in, so I'm going to start. I do have 250 questions of my own, but if we get any time left, I'll ask those questions later. First question is from Michael. Not to go full tinfoil hat, but could it be that the State Department authors agreements they know will not hold or work in order to either continue the war and line the pockets of the deepest state / military industrial complex or because they want Israel to eventually lose in order to benefit Islamic State and oil cartels they have alliance with?
Michael, I don't think that's tinfoil hat territory at all. Uh, Admittedly, I might have even a year ago, but now, look, Eisenhower is the one who alerted us to the military-industrial complex, and that was in 1960 or 61. It was right toward the end of his administration, and no president mentioned it after that, as far as I know, until Donald Trump. Does that mean that it didn't exist, that it went away? No, of course not. But when you have a cartel of industrialists and military men who together have a common interest in selling weaponry and thus in waging war, that goes a long way to explain why we have these endless, pointless wars like Afghanistan with no outcome, with no endpoint, with no goal. I mean, 20 years we've been there. Nobody he's even ever defined what victory would have looked like, much less pursued it. And so the idea that this was to line the pockets, as you say, of the deep state military industrial complex, I think that's what Trump was saying when he was saying that we're going to end these endless wars. And that's one of the reasons why there was such an incredible gang up against him by the media, by the social media giants, by Wall Street, by the top military brass. They all have a finger in this pie, and they don't want to lose it. So yeah, I maybe we're all wearing tinfoil hats here, but I think there's a plenty of reason to believe that that is indeed the case. Now, do they want Israel to eventually lose in order to benefit Islamic states and oil cartels they have alliances with? That might be a little farther afield. On the other hand, I don't think these people have any scruples, and I don't think they have any kind of decent moral compass. You're talking about people who have instituted policies. Look at what they've done to America in the last few months. I mean, the stark contrast couldn't be clearer between an America First president and a president who explicitly repudiated the America First idea. And you have the evidence of corruption everywhere. I mean, did you see what was it, $100,000 that Louis Freeh, the former FBI director, gave to some foundation of Biden's asking for preferment for a position? Well, you know, that not only tells us something about Louis Freeh and tells us something about Biden and his handlers, but it also tells us something or suggests something about everybody else who has a position. How much are they paying? Is it beyond the realm of possibility that everybody who's in this administration has bought their position? When you have the kind of behavior that Hunter Biden has displayed and everybody covered for him, I think we're seeing a depth of corruption that most Americans didn't dream of as even being possible. And now there is a large amount of circumstantial evidence that it exists. So yeah, all those things are on the table. Obviously, I'm not in a position to know for sure, but I think you can't look objectively at the policies that Biden's handlers administration is pursuing and think these people have the best interests of American citizens at heart. They're clearly their priorities are quite different.
Oh boy. Next question is from Gabriella. It's regarding State Department, but she's asking, isn't it true that the State Department bureaucracy has always been anti-Semitic? Are they really just naive?
Oh, they're not naive. They're just ignorant and anti-Semitic to boot. But yes, their ignorance is off the charts. It's astonishing. They have a view of the world and they think that everybody else has it too. I mean, around the world. They think that they will shower money upon some place and then that place will be our friend. So They've given billions of dollars to Pakistan, and Pakistan has given billions of dollars to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and their solution is, let's give them more. And they did. I'm not making that up. That's a fact. But they've
Isn't that
also
the
been,
same thing they did with Iran, or they're trying to do with Iran? Like give them
yes, exactly. They want to give them Iran money, and they think that that will pacify the situation. They can't conceive of, and here again is one reason of this for this is that they don't know anything about Islam and don't think it's relevant. They think that they can give money to Iran and Iran will be our friend then. They don't have any idea of the possibility that the mullahs will receive the money and use it against us and laugh contemptuously at our weakness and stupidity. But if they understood anything about Islam and about the tendency to look at the world in terms of strength and weakness only, then they would understand that and never, it wouldn't even be close to on the table to give Iran any money. And is the State Department anti-Semitic? I want to make sure to get to that before we get too far off it. Yes, no doubt about it. I mean, this goes back to the 40s, probably earlier than that, but certainly in the 40s, there were people who were suggesting that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt bomb Auschwitz to stop the genocide. And he himself was contemptuous of the idea and said, oh, they'll just rebuild it down the road. And of course, there's the infamous incident where a whole boat full of Jewish refugees from Europe were turned away from the United States by State Department officials and ultimately had to, the Voyage of the Damned incident, and they had to go back to Europe and they were all killed. This was because of the Roosevelt State Department that just didn't seem, wasn't concerned about Hitler because he was committing genocide of the Jews. They were concerned about Hitler because he was consolidating Europe under a single government, which they thought would be against their own business interests, which also sheds light upon the military-industrial complex and so on. They very carefully and fastidiously made sure not to speak about the plight of the Jews. Of course, you remember the New York Times not talking about it, burying the stories of the genocide when they reported them at all, deep in the paper, not on the front page ever. And the State Department, the Roosevelt State Department downplayed this aspect of the conflict because they didn't want this to be FDR's war for the Jews. They thought that would turn off the American people, which tells us more about the State Department that's thinking that than about the American people themselves. The Truman State Department right after that was no better. Truman spoke contemptuously of the striped pants crowd. That's what he called them. I'm not really sure what that means, striped pants. I mean, I guess it means fancy people that were that looked down on him as being a haberdasher from Missouri. But I don't know. I'd like to have seen what kind of pants he had in mind. But in any case, enough with the fashion tips. Truman overruled them and against the wishes of his own State Department, recognized the State of Israel. Now, why would the State Department not want to recognize Israel? They were in line with the British foreign ministry that was against the founding of Israel. They didn't want to anger the Arabs. And so the Arabs were reinforced in the idea that they could get their way through rage, through anger, through violence. And so Truman overruled them, but it's very clear that they didn't have any concern for the need for the Jews to have a homeland, particularly after the Holocaust and so on. That was just not something they were concerned about. So yeah, I think that those attitudes are probably still there to a tremendous degree that has been very little recognized. But that was another thing that Trump, all this deep state business with it, we didn't know, right? In 2017, when Trump became president, I assumed, I bet you did too. I thought he was going to implement his policies. I thought that's what happened. It's incredibly naive when I think back on it, that I thought the president would come in and the bureaucracy would do what he wanted because he was the president. It never occurred to me that the bureaucracy would resist him because it had its own agenda. And that, as far as we know, has not happened before in American history. But now the bureaucracy is so entrenched and politicized. And remember, the 6 richest counties in the country are all in Northern Virginia, right around Washington. And so they have a monetary interest in keeping the status quo going. They didn't like Trump because he was bucking it in large part in his support for Israel after Obama had turned against Israel so decisively. And now Biden's handlers are turning against Israel even more decisively than Obama did. Trump was setting a countercurrent going. That's another reason why they had to do him in. So yeah, is the State Department bureaucracy anti-Semitic? I'd say that is absolutely certainly true.
Since we're on this topic, isn't almost every part of our federal government anti-Semitic at this point? I mean, didn't Elon Omar come out and say Israelis basically committing the terrorism for defending themselves because Hamas doesn't have Iron Dome, and everybody clapped?
Yeah, the Democrats pretty much have endorsed Hamas. I mean, they would hotly deny it if they heard me say this. They would say, "Oh, there's Spencer again, saying terrible things." But the reality, come on. I mean, they take us to be stupid, but you just have to look at what Ilhan Omar and AOC and Rashida Tlaib say, and then understand that there really isn't any force that's fighting against them in the Democratic Party. They're the ones setting the agenda, and they're deeply, inveterately anti-Semitic.
I'm gonna read the next. I can discuss this topic with you for another 3 hours. But Rex is asking, what happens now with Abraham accursed? Will they continue?
Yeah, they may well, and that's one good thing that I can tell you. Uh, you might. It's of course it could go 2 ways. One is that the states that have concluded it, and this is another reason why this conflict broke out. It was to pressure the states in the Abraham Accords to drop it and side with the Palestinians, because that's always been a sticking point. And remember that the Abraham Accords were concluded bypassing the Palestinians, just ignoring them on the basis of common interests between Israel and the states, the UAE, Bahrain, so on, that have a common foe in Iran. And so on a pragmatic basis, they concluded these agreements with Israel after John Kerry had said, you cannot possibly conclude peace agreements in the Middle East without first solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that actually, the fact that he was wrong about that actually gives us some hope that the Abraham Accords could continue. They may discard them, the UAE, Bahrain, and the others. They may discard them and rejoin the Palestinian Jihad under pressure. They're under tremendous pressure right now from the other Muslim Arab states and non-Arab Muslim states. But they still have a threat in Iran, which Biden's handlers are enabling. Bahrain is considered by the Islamic Republic of Iran to be the 15th province of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Isn't it 15th, Annie?
Yes.
And the UAE also is afraid of being swallowed up by Iran. Saudi Arabia has a large Shiite Muslim minority on the eastern coast, the part close to Iran. And so Iran has not gone away and is going to be stronger than ever because of Biden's handlers. So that is a reason to keep the Abraham Accords and to strengthen them. So paradoxically, Biden's handlers' absolute irresponsibility in regard to Iran may end up preserving the Abraham Accords.
We need to do something about Islamic Republic of Iran's regime. That should be on top of everybody's list, but that's not today's topic. So let me read you the next question from Stephen Mix. Israel is a rich and powerful nation. Why do they always leave themselves dependent upon world and US aid? Why don't they just build their own Iron Dome and missiles and just finish them all?
I don't think that anybody would like to be completely isolated. If I were to ask you, you could be free of every threat and have every problem that you have solved, and all you have to do is live in solitary confinement for the rest of your life. Would you go for it? And this is the
No, I wouldn't.
problem. Well, there you go. And this is the problem Israel faces, that it's already tremendously isolated on the world stage. And the United States is still very much Israel's ally, although the Democrats are working very hard to change that. Israel does not want to lose its only ally any more than you want to lose your family and your friends. It's just human nature. And so it may be true that they could solve the problem definitively on their own. But if they did, then the entire world would be set against them. And it may be entirely reasonable to conclude that some parts of that world would decide to take up arms against Israel in a way that has not been done, not been attempted before. Remember, Erdogan called for an Islamic army, an Islamic army. Here again, it's all about Islam. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, called a few years back for an Islamic army to be raised up among all the nations of the world, all the Muslim nations of the world, to fight Israel. Now, Israel has in the past defeated 5 of its enemies at once, 6 of its enemies at once, but imagine if that were to really happen. And the 57 government Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 countries, or 56 countries and the Palestinian Authority, took up arms against Israel. It would be very hard for that tiny country to defend itself against a massive force like that. Yes, it has beaten massive forces much larger than itself in the past, but 57 countries? And so Israel does not want to be completely isolated on the world stage, and having a powerful friend is a good thing to have. At the same time, of course, now the United States is not going to be as powerful, and Biden's handlers are working hard to weaken it. And that's going to have implications for Israel as well as for the rest of the world.
That makes a lot of sense. So Ross is asking, do you think the Israelis can overcome the loss of the propaganda war? That is the allowance of the fiction of the occupied territories.
The propaganda war is very important and very little understood how thoroughgoing it is. I tried to explain this to some degree in The Palestinian Delusion, available now. But seriously, the idea of the manipulation of the international media is very, very slightly understood. People know the media is biased, but they don't know how thoroughly and fully I think it's a propaganda organ for the international left, for the Palestinian jihad, for the global jihad in general, for the idea of the destruction of borders, the whole leftist agenda. So it's very hard to fight back against that because, you know, the IDF, I see the IDF, you should follow the IDF on Twitter if you don't already. And you will see the IDF very carefully, painstakingly answering the propaganda and giving the truth. But how many times have you seen the IDF's responses being quoted in the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN or the rest of them? Meanwhile, AP is sharing offices with Hamas in Gaza and then claims not to know that Hamas was there, which means that they're either terrible journalists or liars who were in bed with Hamas. And AP is the largest media organization in the world. You have all the other media organizations on the side of Hamas and retailing Palestinian jihad propaganda. That is a war that Israel needs to fight and keep fighting, but it's stacked, just like it's stacked against conservatives in America in terms of social media. And we're banned and blocked and shadow banned and boxed in everywhere, while the left controls all the means of public discourse. This has to change. I'm still holding out hope that Trump is going to start, as he promised, a social media organization that could change things considerably. And if the hegemony of the social media giants is broken, then this whole situation could change. But right now, it's very, very, very serious.
Uh, I do look forward to a social media that is not going to censor us, and it's definitely icing on the cake if it's somehow owned or managed or ideas of President Trump on it. Um, Here's another question back to why Israel is not doing something. Why does Israel never immediately destroy the top Hamas leaders? Does that even matter if they do?
Well, it matters and it doesn't. It's kind of like Osama bin Laden. You know, Osama bin Laden was killed. It was a big victory for the United States and a big electoral point for Barack Obama and the Democrats because it happened on his watch. Although I don't think he can justly be given credit for it. The operation to take him out was begun long before he became president, and it was Biden, as a matter of fact, who was against it in his administration. But anyway, that's another story. Osama bin Laden was killed. Al Qaeda goes on. Abu Bakr al Baghdadi was killed. ISIS goes on. These movements are not charismatic movements based around some powerful leader who, if he dies, the whole thing fades away. These are movements that are based on an ideology, on a belief system, on Islam. Islam lives on. It's kind of like, actually, according to Islamic tradition, when Muhammad died, and all the Muslims are mourning, according to the story. And Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph, the first successor of Muhammad, stood up and said, if you worshipped Muhammad, then I have to tell you, Muhammad is dead. But if you worshipped Allah, Allah is still alive, and Islam goes on. Great, inspiring story if you're a jihadi. So it's the same thing with these people. Israel could take them out, I think should take them out. I don't have any idea why they don't. I would hope that it's not because they don't know where they are. They seem to have a whole lot of real good information. I was impressed by a video I saw during this last conflict where the fellow who's the security guard at a building that was a Hamas installation is talking to the IDF on the phone and saying, we need another hour because, you know, Israel gives them time to evacuate before destroying these Hamas installations. And I thought, wow, the IDF found the phone number of the security guard of this building. I'm impressed, really. That's thorough. And I would hope then that they have the address of Ismail Haniya's villa in Qatar and could take it out, but they haven't. So maybe they have reasons for that of their own. I can also point to all the mysterious explosions and deaths of Iranian nuclear scientists as evidence that they seem to be able to do these things with relative impunity. So, well, they're still hoping, you know, and I hope that ultimately the Hamas leadership will beat Mossad.
Agreed. Okay, we have time for probably one or two more questions. So this one's from Cynthia. Do you think there's a chance the US will go to war with Israel, against Israel because of the NATO occurred and with Erdogan desiring to attack Israel?
Well, Erdogan wants to attack Israel, but I think that at this point, if Erdogan attacked Israel, and he knows this, then he would be no longer in NATO. And so he doesn't want that to happen. That's why he hasn't attacked Israel. That's not to say that he won't, but I do not think, I hope I'm right, but I don't think that NATO would go to war with Israel or that the United States would go to war with Israel. The United States might go to war with Israel sometime down the road if the left's hegemony is solidified, if free elections are destroyed, the United States becomes the authoritarian woke nanny state that they want us to be, and then the jihad squad of Omar and Tlaib and AOC are setting foreign policy, then yeah, we could go to war with Israel then. That's a very real possibility, but we're still a few years from that.
Michael is asking, how do we get rid of all these corrupt partisans embedded within the State Department and other agency? You know what? I'm going to go further and add to Michael's questions. How do we get rid of all of this deep corruption within our federal government?
Well, it's very simple. We need to elect a decent president in 24, a president who is aware of this problem and has the courage and the power to sweep out these agencies and replace the personnel that's in there now with patriots. This is, of course, a lot easier said than done. We have to have free elections, and that's by no means guaranteed at this point. And if we have free elections, then we have to win them, which is also not necessarily true, although it is likely that we would win free elections. And we have to have a president who is aware of these as a problem. And I think Trump came in not knowing. For all the great things that he did, I don't think even he knew how deep the deep state was or how much he would be resisted within the government bureaucracy. Now we know. So the next president who's any good ought to be able to go in there and clear out this entrenched bureaucracy of internationalist, socialist haters of America. So we can only hope that, I mean, I think that it's very likely that if we do have an American who's elected in 24, that is a patriot who's elected in 24, then he will clean this out, or she, or whoever. But that's the foundation. If we don't have a president elected in 24, you might as well turn out the lights and look for an apartment in Uruguay. The United States will be over as a free society.
Oh boy, we need Robert Spencer as a president in 2020. I'm just gonna say it. Okay, Robert. Very last question that I always ask. Where do our audience, especially those who joined us recently, where do they go to get your book, read your work, get educated, and stay on top of what's happening?
Yeah, thank you, Annie. I'm at jihadwatch.org, updated many times daily with news and commentary about jihad activity in the United States and around the world. And Jihad Watch RS on Twitter. There's a Jihad Watch Facebook group, but I'll bet you won't be able to find it because Facebook doesn't want you to. The books, The Palestinian Delusion is the subtitle is The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process. It shows why all the peace agreements have failed, why they always will fail, what must be done instead. You can get it in Amazon. You can also get it at Barnes & Noble. Better would be to go to, if there is any independent bookstore anywhere near you, go there, ask them to order it. And if they tell you they won't order it, then never go there again, because they're just as bad as Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But in any case, we should be glad at least that we can still even have books available that dissent from the leftist agenda, and hope that our luck continues to hold in that regard.
Very true. As always, Robert, we are very grateful for you, for your knowledge, for your time, for your wisdom, and thank you for sharing an hour with us this evening.
And thank you, Annie. Always a pleasure to see you, and always fun to do this. So everyone have a good evening, and thanks again.
Absolutely. And to our audience who stayed with us until now, thank you so much. We do appreciate you as well. And remember, all these webinars are brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you'd like to support these webinars, all you gotta do is go to frontpagemag.com and consider making 100% tax deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.